Hi, fantasy readers. This is Corinne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Today's story is one that hit me a bit personally in some funny ways. My parents are both retired music teachers, and all of us had to take piano and a second instrument, and we all ended up doing choir one way or another. So when I came across this story about a young man who strikes a bargain around his piano skills, I found both the bargain and the stakes a little too relatable. One Fair Eve is written by Lyndsey Hall, who lives on the edge of Sherwood Forest. It's one of the most magical places in England's history, and the inspiration for her debut novel, The Fair Queen. Lyndsey loves to travel and try her hand at new things, but is most at home when curled up in a chair with a cup of tea and a good book, usually accompanied by at least one dog. Today's narrator is Paeter Frandsen, host of Christian Geek Central. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from both the author and the narrator. For now, please enjoy One Fair Eve by Lyndsey Hall.
Chapter 1, March 20th, 1880, Hartwood, England. Pip dashed up the street, slipping on the wet cobblestones. He held the envelope up to his eyes, but rain still streamed down his round, horn-rimmed glasses. When he breathed out, they clouded over, and he almost ran into Mrs. Baker as she crossed the road with Fergus, her yapping little dog. Apologizing over his shoulder, he hurried on towards the tall, narrow house with the brass plate beside the door. He was late for his piano lesson. His tutor, Mr. Erickson, would tut and make him play the Bach piece again. Unless... He clutched the letter from the Axton Conservatory tighter and rapped on the door with his knuckles, hopping from foot to foot. The door opened to reveal a tall, green-eyed man wearing a brown, knitted cardigan and woolen trousers. "Master Reed, you're late. Again." Pip stepped inside and hung his dripping coat on the rack before wiping his glasses on a handkerchief from his pocket. "I know. I'm sorry, Mr. Erickson. I was waiting for this." He brandished the letter. His tutor's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly, and his mood seemed to lighten. He ushered Pip into the small room at the front of the house, which was predominantly taken up by an elegant piano. "Well, let's see then. What does it say?" "I waited to open it with you, Mr. Erickson. I thought you'd want to be the first to know if I got in." The gray-haired Swedish music teacher nodded, and Pip felt a rush of satisfaction at having made the right decision. They both took their usual seats in the practice room, Pip on the piano bench and his tutor in a wing-backed chair by the window, and Pip tore the envelope open. He slid the single sheet of paper out and read the brief letter thanking him for applying to the conservatory, and politely rejecting his application. The ground seemed to crumble away beneath Pip, and he felt as though he were falling. Rejected? It couldn't be. He'd done well in his interview and performance, hadn't he? Sure, he'd been nervous. Wasn't everyone when they auditioned for the thing that meant the most to them? "Well?" Mr. Erickson asked, reaching for the paper. Pip let him take it, his hand dropping into his lap like a dead weight. He'd ruined his only chance. He would never get another audition. He wouldn't be going to the most prestigious music school for miles around. He wouldn't play at the world's most famous concert halls in Paris and Vienna, or stand on stage at the Royal Albert Hall performing his favorite piece, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, for an audience of thousands. His blood ran cold. He'd be forced to join his father down the mine. As the only son, he'd been expected to follow in his father's footsteps and provide for the family when he came of age, but his musical talent had given him hope for a different future, a better, safer future, where he could still afford to support his mother and sisters financially, but without the risk of being killed in a cave-in or an explosion, or getting lost inside the mine and starving to death before he could find his way out. He shuddered. Mr. Erickson finished reading the letter and folded it up neatly, tucking it into the inside pocket of his waistcoat. "Well, I am surprised and more than a little disappointed." Pip's heart sank. He hated disappointing his tutor. Victor Erickson had been a world-renowned pianist before retiring to rural England to become a music tutor. He was a very particular, exacting teacher, never letting Pip get away with a single mistake. In some lessons, Pip had played the same piece dozens of times, restarting every time he missed a note or his timing was off. It was exhausting, but it had made him into the talented, dedicated musician he was today. Or so Pip had thought. "Which piece did you play? The Beethoven?" Pip nodded. "Show me." He nodded, his pulse picking up speed as he moved to the bench and lifted the cover on the pianoforte. He didn't think he'd made any mistakes in his performance, but why else would the panel have rejected him? He straightened the sheet music, took a deep breath, and began. The notes flowed from his fingers like second nature. He'd played this sonata so many times he knew it inside out, could have played it backwards if asked. His hands danced over the keys as the intensity built, the music filling the room and carrying him on a wave of melody, a feeling as familiar as breathing. When he finished, and the final note died in the air between him and Mr. Erickson, he couldn't bring himself to turn and face his tutor. A small sigh came from the teacher, and finally Pip swiveled round on the bench to meet his eye. His tutor wasn't smiling, but neither was he frowning. "Well, that was certainly a very precise representation of Beethoven's Sonata No. 14. Pip felt a tiny swell of pride in his chest, but the fact that Mr. Erickson still wasn't smiling made him falter. "It is not talent or skill that you are lacking, Master Reed. It is heart, passion." All of the air rushed out of Pip's lungs in one silent gasp. He had passion, didn't he? "You play the notes with familiarity and comfort. You know the piece almost too well. If this is how you performed at the interview, then I'm afraid I'm not surprised you did not get in." A crushing weight pressed down on Pip as the dream he'd built up around himself came crashing down. He'd have to go home and tell his parents that he hadn't gotten into the conservatory. He'd have to look at his father's stern face as he told him that, come September, he'd be joining him down the mine. Tears pressed at the backs of his eyes, and he forced them away angrily. He might have to accept his depressing fate, but he would not let Mr. Erickson see how distraught he was. He picked at the threadbare cushion on the bench, pulling a loose thread and refusing to look up until the thread of tears was gone. The tutor clasped his hands in front of him, leaning forwards to close the distance between them. When he spoke, his voice was low and had taken on a strange timbre Pip had never heard coming from the man. "Philip, I know you feel disappointed. There isn't anything you wouldn't do to get into the conservatory, is there?" Pip looked up, confused, and shook his head. "I'd do anything. Do you think they'd give me another chance?" The older man rubbed a hand over his short gray beard, eyes narrowed. He appeared to be wrestling with something internally, his jaw taut. Finally, he sat back, expression clearing. "My piano needs a new string. Today is the Heartwood market, up in the big field. If you go to the market and find Master Dobson's stall and purchase a new string for me, I will write to the conservatory and explain your circumstances. I will see if I can arrange for you to repeat the performance part of the interview. How does that sound?" Pip leapt up from the bench, hope and desperation making him giddy. "Really, Mr. Erickson? You would do that? Thank you, sir, thank you. I'll go to the market right away." He started to gather his things and put his damp coat back on, wanting to leave before the tutor could change his mind and take back his offer. Mr. Erickson took a small leather pouch out of his trouser pocket and placed it in Pip's palm, but instead of letting go, his other hand gripped Pip's wrist tightly. His green eyes were a shade darker as he leaned close, towering over Pip and casting him into shadow. "Be sure that this is what you want, Philip Reed. If you have even an ounce of doubt that this is the future you truly desire, then I will say good day and wish you well. But if you are sure that the conservatory is your destiny, then I wish you only good luck." Pip stared at the man for several seconds, mouth dry as the words tumbled over one another in his mind. The conservatory was his only dream. He would do anything, give anything, to have the chance to attend, to escape his fate in the mine, to escape Heartwood. "It is what I want, Mr. Erickson. I'm sure." The piano teacher let go of the coin pouch and released Pip's wrist, stepping backward and taking the shadows with him. As Pip stepped outside and turned to thank his tutor one more time, he caught the faraway look on the man's face as his gaze turned towards the field where the market was held. "Give Master Dobson my best." And he shut the door, leaving Pip standing in the street, a peculiar feeling settling over him. Chapter 2. The walk up to the market didn't take long. Heartwood was a small village bordered by acres of farmland, little more than a cluster of houses, a church, post office, school, and the small train station that carried the miners to and from Axton and the surrounding towns. On the other side of the field where the market was held lay Heartwood Pit, the iron mine where Pip's father worked, and where Pip was destined to spend his life, if Mr. Erickson's plan was unsuccessful. And beyond the pit head was dense forest as far as the eye could see. Pip trudged up the hill and through the open farm gate, feeling the weight of the coin purse jostling in his coat pocket. It had been years since he'd visited the market. Usually his mother did the shopping, coming home each Saturday with baskets full of fresh fruit and vegetables, balls of wool for knitting, and lace collars to brighten up his sister's old dresses. Pip hadn't even known there was a stall that sold musical instruments and equipment. As he reached the big field, the market spread out before him. A variety of horse-drawn carts and canvas-covered wagons stood behind tables laden with the sellers' wares. Horses were tethered loosely, munching on the long grass while they waited to take their owners home. Hand carts and large wheelbarrows stood behind some stalls, some still laden with excess produce. Pip's worn leather boots slipped on the wet grass as he passed tables spread with jars of homemade jams and preserves, leather goods and lace-trimmed tablecloths. Heaps of carrots, their leafy green tops brushing the muddy ground, sat next to baskets of mushrooms and garlic bulbs. A ruddy-faced woman in a pinafore fussed over heads of lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage in every shade of green, red, and purple. Shouts from the sellers and the rhythmic clang of metal on metal coming from the blacksmith's stall filled the air, which was still heavy with moisture despite the rain having eased. As he passed, the greengrocer cried out and attempted to shoo one of the horses who had taken a fancy to her carrots. Pip pushed his glasses up his nose with his forefinger and chewed the inside of his cheek. He'd purchased the string, go straight back to Mr. Erickson's house and practice the Beethoven piece until his fingers bled. He would put as much passion into it as he could, and hopefully that would be enough to convince the panel at Axton Conservatory. He couldn't let this be it. He couldn't let his chance at following his dreams and playing music for the rest of his life be dashed on the cobblestones, along with his future. He wouldn't let himself be sent down that mine to die. Pip passed another stall, this one laden with knitted scarves and mittens, and squinted to see just 2 more tables ahead. It would be just his luck if the stall he needed wasn't present this week. The final stall was a painted caravan, set a little away from the rest of the market, with a wooden sign bearing the name Master Dobson and Company in gold leaf. Pip's heart leapt into his throat, and he picked up his pace, one hand going to his pocket where the bag of coins weighed heavy, full of promise. There didn't appear to be anyone manning the stall as Pip approached. He stood in front of the caravan's hatch, taking in the neat stacks of sheet music tied with red ribbon, the rows of shiny metal tools and wooden implements, some of which Pip recognized from tuning the piano. "Hello?" Pip called, peering deeper into the caravan. A head popped into view, fuzzy gray hair sticking out from the sides, matching the gray broom-shaped mustache that sat above a thin-lipped mouth. The man was a good few inches shorter than Pip, who himself wasn't the tallest tree in the forest, and he wore a dark green suit with a brocade waistcoat, a silver pocket watch chain hanging from his chest pocket. "Oh, my apologies, young sir. I didn't see you there. How can I help you this fine spring equinox?" The man's accent sounded strange to Pip's ears. He couldn't place it. Most of the miners and traders who traveled to Heartwood for work came from Axton, but the city accent was sharper and more clipped than the villagers'. This gentleman's voice sounded like he was one note away from bursting into song. "Mr. Erickson sent me. He needs a new string for his piano." The little man's brows rose. "Mr. Erickson? Indeed, indeed." He studied Pip with a watery but intense gaze from under straggly gray eyebrows. "How is Victor?" "He's well, thank you." Master Dobson hummed and stroked his mustache with his thumb and forefinger, still studying Pip. Icy cold fingers raked down Pip's spine, and his flesh broke out in goosebumps. He resisted the urge to rub the back of his neck or shuffle his feet under the strange man's scrutiny. "Teaching you the piano, is he?" Pip nodded. "I'm hoping to attend Axton Conservatory, but—" He wasn't sure why he said it, but Master Dobson's curiosity seemed to have been piqued. He leaned forward, dark eyes sparkling as a sudden ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting the field in a golden glow and limning the odd little man. "Go on, lad. But—" When Pip didn't respond straight away, he supplied the answer himself. "You're worried you won't get in?" Pip chewed his bottom lip, forehead furrowing. "I failed my interview. My application was rejected. The letter came this morning." Master Dobson nodded eagerly, to Pip's dismay. He appeared altogether too excited to hear of Pip's abject failure. "Is that so? And Victor sent you to my stall, did he?" Unsure how the two were connected, Pip nodded. "Interesting, interesting. Well, I believe I may be able to help you, young sir. You have a piano string?" Master Dobson chuckled, and the sound sent a shudder through Pip, like a cat's claws on a chalkboard. "Oh, yes, I certainly have a piano string or two. But that isn't all." He rubbed his hands together, his dark eyes shining, the pupils seeming to swallow the irises so they looked entirely black. "What would you say if I told you there was a way to make your dream of becoming a world-renowned musician come true?" "What do you mean?" "Mr. Erickson is going to petition the conservatory to give me a second chance. If I practice really hard, they might still let me in. Is that what you mean? Do you know someone on the panel?" Master Dobson shook his head. "What I'm offering has nothing to do with practicing, Master Reed. If you're amenable, you can leave here today, and every time you play your instrument, every single piece will be the most beautiful, most exquisite piece of music any listener has ever heard. You will be celebrated as a musical prodigy, a genius. Your talent will know no bounds." "How is that possible?" Pip's voice was little more than an exhale. "Magic, Master Reed." Everything went still, as though the world had stopped turning for a fraction of a second. Pip held his breath. Master Dobson's face broke into a slow, wide smile, his crooked teeth like fence posts beneath that brush of a mustache. "Magic? That's right, magic. Your greatest desire at your fingertips. For a price, of course." "But isn't that cheating?" Master Dobson chortled. "My, you're an honorable young lad. But I don't believe it is cheating, no. No more than possessing natural talent, or the privilege of a great tutor, the time to practice, and the opportunity to audition for such a prestigious conservatory. You already have an advantage over so many young musicians, Master Reed. Why not use every resource at your disposal to achieve your dream?" Pip turned the man's words over in his mind. It was true, he was lucky, privileged even, to have had the opportunity to learn a musical instrument. His parents had paid for his lessons, and they'd indulged him when he had shown real talent, rather than forcing him to put childish dreams aside and face the reality of his future as a minor. If there were some way to show them they had made the right choice by encouraging and supporting him, didn't he owe it to his parents and Mr. Erikson to take it? What would I have to do? Master Dobson's eyes glistened greedily, and he ran his tongue over his thin lips, snatching up a piece of paper that Pip had presumed to be sheet music, but he now saw was a letter. All you need to do today is to sign your name here, and the rest will be taken care of. Hesitantly, Pip took the pen and paper that Master Dobson proffered, reading the elegant cursive hand and understanding less than half of the elaborate language. What does it say? Master Dobson waved a hand dismissively. Oh, nothing much. Just that you agree to the terms and are willing to accept the conditions, and in exchange you will be furnished with musical ability the likes the world has never borne witness to. That sounded like exactly what Pip had dreamed of, to be the most talented piano player to ever live, to escape Heartwood and his fate as a minor and the gray, impoverished future he dreaded. He could scarcely believe all it would take was a signature on a piece of paper. He paused, pen hovering over the paper. And I'll get to audition for the conservatory again? That much is up to Mr. Erikson, young man, but if he is still the persuasive and eloquent gentleman I remember him to be, then I doubt there is anything he could not arrange. The little gray-haired man loomed over Pip as he scrawled his name in black ink on the bottom of the page. As soon as the final flourish of his signature was done, a clap of thunder sounded overhead, and the sky darkened. A chill ran down Pip's spine as a breeze lifted his hair and rustled Master Dobson's mustache. The man's pupils were so large now that there was barely any white visible, and his teeth glittered like blades in the low light. Master Dobson snatched the paper from Pip's hands and folded it into his pocket before handing Pip a brown paper packet containing a new piano string. Pip stumbled back a step, a growing sense of unease in the pit of his stomach. His hand went to the coin purse in his pocket. Here, he said, setting the pouch on the caravan's shelf. For the string and the magic. No payment necessary, said the man from within the caravan, slamming drawers and rattling locks as he prepared to leave. Pip frowned and followed Master Dobson round to the front of the caravan, where 2 pure white horses were harnessed. But I thought you said there was a price for the magic. Master Dobson hopped up onto the seat and took the horse's reins in his hands before looking down at Pip, a terrifying grin on his suddenly sharp, strange features. The man was barely recognizable now. His skin had taken on a greenish-gray hue, and he appeared almost monstrous as he hissed, There is a price indeed, Master Reed, but not in coin. Your dreams will be made reality, young sir, but only until the day of the spring equinox, the year after you turn 18. On that day, we will call in your debt, and you will join us in the fair realm for the remainder of your days. Best of luck, Master Reed. I'll be seeing you soon. At that, the man snapped the reins, and the horses took off, pulling the caravan at a speed Pip wouldn't have believed possible if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. He shouted to the man to stop, but within moments the caravan had disappeared into the vast forest on the edge of the field. A weight dropped into the pit of Pip's stomach, and he started to shake as the sky broke and fat raindrops began to fall. What had he done? Chapter 3. March 20th, 1882, Vienna, Austria. Pip stood in the wings at the Wiener Musikverein, one of the grand, newly built concert halls in Vienna, and listened to the rapturous applause coming from the stalls. Verity had just finished her violin performance, a stirring rendition of Vivaldi's concerto in G minor, and was curtsying to the audience as bouquets of flowers were thrown at her feet. She turned to walk off stage and caught sight of him, a shy smile playing at her lips as their eyes met. Her dark hair was pinned up in a fashionable style, but fine strands had fallen down to frame her face and a light flush warmed her cheeks. Heat rushed through Pip's veins, and his mouth went dry. She was the most exquisite creature he had ever set eyes upon. On stage, the lights had dimmed as 4 stagehands brought out the pianoforte and positioned it in the center, ready for his performance. "Good luck, Philip," Verity murmured as she passed, placing her hand on his arm momentarily before continuing to the backstage area. A shiver went through him at the touch. "Thank you," Pip replied, but she was already out of earshot. It was just him now. He turned to the stage, where the piano and the audience both waited in silence. He ran a hand through his wavy, light brown hair. This was it. No turning back. He took a deep, steadying breath, pushed his horn-rimmed glasses up with his forefinger, and walked towards his instrument. A polite smattering of applause met his appearance on stage, but he kept his eyes on the piano. He swept his coat-tails out behind him and sat on the stool, lifted the cover, and placed his fingers on the keys. One more deep inhale, and on the exhale, he began to play. The music flowed from his fingers with ease, rising and falling with his breath, surging up from his very core. It filled the concert hall, swelling to reach every corner, taking on a life of its own. Pip closed his eyes and felt the music take over. He was just a conduit, channeling the composer's exquisite combination of notes, a vessel for the beauty and precision of the piece. His fingers flew over the keys as the music built to a crescendo, never missing a single note. The tiny hairs on his arms and the back of his neck stood on end, as though an electrical current surged through him, charging the air around him as his hands moved faster and faster, his foot pushing the pedals, sweat beading on his brow and sliding down the back of his crisp white shirt. When the piece was finished, and the final note had faded from the air, Pip took a shuddering breath without opening his eyes. As he exhaled, calmness expanded in his chest, where before the tension and nerves had been bundled tightly. Now he felt light, unburdened. The audience exploded into applause, and Pip finally opened his eyes. Chairs screeched as one by one the spectators got to their feet and gave him a standing ovation. Pride rushed in to replace the calm, and a satisfied smile spread across Pip's face. He stood, bowed to the audience, and left the stage, applause and shouts of bravo still ringing in his wake. Just before he stepped behind the curtain, he thought he recognized one of the faces in the front row, but when he glanced back at the audience, the seat was empty. Outside the concert hall, Pip adjusted his cashmere scarf and shivered at the chill in the air. Despite spring having officially begun that very day, no one had thought to tell the weather in Vienna. The door swung open, and Verity appeared, carrying her violin case and wearing a heavy cloak with a rabbit fur trim. Pip rushed forwards. "Let me help you with that, Miss Whitley." He took the violin case in his left hand and offered her his right arm. She took it with a smile. "Thank you, Philip. And as always, please call me Verity." A blush warmed Pip's cheeks, and suddenly he was grateful for the cold air. They walked together through the lamp-lit streets, admiring the elegant architecture and commenting on the sights, sounds, and smells of the city. The glistening pavements were a world away from the dull cobblestones of Hartwood. A light fog hovered preternaturally above the ground, clinging to their ankles and giving the city an ethereal ambiance. Verity squeezed his arm. "Can you believe it, Philip? We're really here, in the city where both Beethoven and Mozart lived and composed. You can almost feel it in the air, can't you? The inspiration, the magic." A shiver ran through Pip at the word magic. He tried his hardest to forget the strange man at the market in Hartwood, but each year, as the days had crept closer to the spring equinox, his mind had turned to the contract he had signed, the promise Master Dobson had made, the payment the man had demanded in return. He hadn't believed it at first. He'd returned to Mr. Erickson's house with the piano string to practice his piece for the repeat audition. At his next lesson, his tutor had been somewhat gentler with his criticisms and more generous with his praise than Pip was used to. but he put that down to the rejection letter and Erickson's kindness rather than any enchantment. He had charmed the panel at the conservatory with his second audition, playing a more difficult Bach piece after hours and hours of perfecting his performance. So when the acceptance letter had arrived, it had been easy to convince himself that he'd gotten in on pure talent and hard work. Since then, he'd only grown in his abilities and confidence, as was to be expected now that he was a student of one of the finest musical institutions in England. And yet, he still couldn't suppress a shudder at the mere mention of magic. Indeed, I feel incredibly lucky to be here, especially in your company, Miss Verity. Verity beamed at him, and a bubble of anxious excitement rose in his throat. He swallowed it down. Residents and visitors of Vienna hurried past, clutching their coats about them and quickening their steps to get home and out of the cold. Pip felt his feet slowing as they approached the guest house where Verity and the other female students from the 6 British conservatories were staying. They came to a stop in front of the building's ornate edifice. Pip breathed in deeply, inhaling the cold Viennese air with its scents of rain and wood smoke. If he closed his eyes, he could have been standing in Hartwood, the smoke from the chimneys mingling with the metallic tang from the iron mine. Verity, Something darted into the shadows between the guest house and the next building, and Pip jolted. He stepped in front of Verity, one arm holding her back as he squinted into the darkness. "What is it?" Verity asked, leaning to peer over his shoulder. Her breath tickled his ear and moved the short hairs at the nape of his neck, and Pip's skin broke out in goosebumps. "I'm not sure. Perhaps a fox or a stray dog. You should hurry inside to be safe. But before you do..." It had to be now, or he might never have the courage to do it again. Standing beneath a flickering gas lamp, Pip took Verity's left hand. He slid the rabbit fur-lined glove off and brought her knuckle to his lips, his eyes never leaving her face. Surprise widened her eyes, but a smile played about her mouth. "Miss Verity Whitley, ever since the time I heard you play, I have been enchanted by you, your talent, your beauty, and from the first moment you smiled at me, I have been bewitched. I am yours completely, if you will have me." Pip took a deep breath. Verity's eyes shimmered with silver, and the smile that had teased her lips now shone brightly. "Oh, Philip," she breathed. "Verity, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, it was as though time had frozen. Pip held his breath as snowflakes began to fall around them. The sounds of horses' hooves and a train whistling as it pulled out of the nearby station fell away. The world shrank down to just the two of them, standing there in the circle of light from the gas lamp, standing at a fork in the road, choosing their own destiny. When she didn't respond right away, Pip's heart felt as if it might burst out of his chest. "I haven't got a ring. Not yet. And I haven't spoken to your father, but I will. Verity, Yes." Pip's throat constricted, and he had to swallow before he could speak. When he did, his voice came out at an octave higher than usual. "Pardon me?" Verity's eyes danced. "Yes, I will marry you, Philip." Grinning, Pip removed his glasses and wiped them with his pocket square. Once they were back in position on his face, Verity pressed a kiss to his cheek and bid him good night, a beatific smile on her face as she stepped out of the ethereal glow cast by the lamplight and disappeared into the guest house. "Master Reed," came a strange voice from the shadows. "Who's there?" Pip's voice quavered only slightly, and he squinted into the darkness between the buildings. He thought he recognized the lilting accent, but he couldn't quite place it. "1 year, Master Reed. Enjoy your success. In 1 year's time you'll be leaving all of this behind. Oh, and congratulations on your engagement." Pip's blood chilled, his limbs frozen in place. "Master Dobson?" But there was no response. and when Pip's body thawed and he leapt into the shadows to discover the source of the voice, the alley was empty. Chapter 4. March 18th, 1883, Hartwood, England. For months, Pip had tried to think of a way to escape his terrible bargain, to remain in the human realm with his beloved Verity, but to no avail. He couldn't remember the wording of the contract. He hadn't been able to decipher much of the convoluted language at the time, but he felt as though he was trapped in a deal with the devil. His only conclusion was to stay as far away from Hartwood as possible. But then, Master Dobson, or one of his lackeys, had come to Pip in Austria and seemed to have no trouble discovering his whereabouts or following him across the globe. And in the end, it didn't matter much anyway. At the beginning of March in Pip's 18th year, a letter had arrived at the conservatory dormitory addressed to Pip, written in his mother's hand. His father had taken ill, and he was needed at home in Hartwood at his earliest convenience. "We'll take a carriage to the station," Verity had said when he informed her, packing her violin into its silk-lined case and pulling on her gloves. "What do you mean? I can't ask you to accompany me, Verity. This is my burden to bear." His fiancée had given him a withering look. "What's yours is mine now, darling, for better or worse, or at least it soon will be." Pip had forced a small smile. Delaying the wedding date until his bargain had passed hadn't been difficult. Verity had agreed they should wait until they had both finished their studies. It would give her enough time to plan an extravagant affair with every bell and whistle, whilst they both continued to study and perform regularly. Pip felt tremendous guilt for deceiving her, but he couldn't bear the thought of marrying her only to be torn away from her and held prisoner by the creatures with whom he'd made the ill-fated bargain. That would be a much worse stain on her honor than a broken engagement. "Fine," he had said, giving her a conciliatory smile. "My mother and sisters will be pleased to see you. We'd better hurry. The next train to Hartwood is at 10 past the hour." Inside the velvet-draped carriage, Verity had removed the glove from her left hand, admired the gold filigree and opal engagement ring Pip had bought with his earnings, and twined her long fingers through Pip's. The warmth of her small hand contrasted with Pip's large, cool one, and he had brushed his thumb over her skin, soaking in her heat. He'd been glad she was joining him. Her presence grounded him and gave him strength, something he'd only ever felt before when his fingers were on the ivory keys of his instrument. Pip's father lay under a thin blanket, a sheen of sweat on his ashen face. His chest made a terrible rasping sound, and a hollow appeared beneath his ribcage with every breath. "What happened?" Pip asked his mother quietly as she poured tea into faded porcelain teacups. Verity took hers with a grateful smile, added a dash of milk from the jug, and sipped. "Delicious. Thank you, Mrs. Reed." Pip's mother nodded at his fiancé before sitting down and picking up her own cup. "It was an unfortunate accident," she said with a shake of her head. "He was working late last Thursday night. The others had already gone on to the pub, and he was closing the pit down for the day. He tripped on something or other and fell into the pit. Luckily it was quite a shallow part, or he'd have been killed. But he lay there in the freezing cold, unable to move all night, until the men on the early shift arrived the next morning. His workmates thought he'd decided to come straight home, and I thought he was just having a drink and lost track of time. I never imagined—" She took a handkerchief from the inside of her sleeve and dabbed at her eyes and nose. Verity reached over and put a reassuring hand on his mother's shaking one, the teacup rattling in its saucer. Pip's mother pressed her lips into a thin smile that emphasized the new wrinkles she'd formed since he last saw her. It occurred to him that both of his parents had aged significantly in the past 2 years. Their hair that had been thick and dark before he'd left was now streaked with gray. Their skin had become sallow and lined, their bodies frail. How had his leaving caused them to change so dramatically? He took in his sisters, sitting on the threadbare settee in the lounge, Lucy reading a social pamphlet while Eleanor darned a pair of stockings. They wore elegant dresses adorned with beaded lace collars draped over jutting collarbones. Pip, on the other hand, had gained weight from the rich food served at the conservatory and the few treats he could afford with his income from performing for the upper classes at their lavish parties. He sent as much as he could back home to his parents, only keeping enough to support himself and putting a little away each month for his future with Verity, but perhaps it wasn't enough? And now that his father was unable to work, it certainly would not be. "How will you manage without father's salary? Do you need more money? I could send more. Whatever I make is yours." His mother dabbed at her nose with the handkerchief and lowered her voice. "After paying our dues, buying the girls new dresses, and putting away enough money for decent dowries, things are tight." She tucked the handkerchief back inside her sleeve. "We'll manage, Pip. We always do. You're a good boy. You keep your money. You've earned it. Treat this lovely girl of yours." She squeezed Verity's hand and smiled, eyes shining with unshed tears. But Pip couldn't conjure more than a grimace. Whatever happened, he could not go through with the bargain. He needed to find a way out of it, and soon, before it was too late for everyone. Pip dropped the last book on the gnarled wooden table with a thump. He'd scoured every single book on fairies and folklore and magic in Heartwood Library and found nothing about breaking a bargain with a fairy creature. The spring equinox was almost here, and he had no way to stop Master Dobson from taking him. He slammed the cover of the large tome he'd been studying, causing the petite, white-haired librarian to shush him sternly, but he didn't care. He cursed the day he'd set eyes on the strange little man and his colorful caravan. He'd been stupid and greedy and arrogant to accept the man's dark promise. He wished he'd never gone to buy the piano string for Mr. Erikson. Mr. Erikson. That was it. His tutor had been the one to suggest Pip visit Master Dobson's stall. That must mean he knew the man and had some dealings with him in the past. Perhaps he would know something that could help Pip escape the agreement. Chapter 5. "Philip, I'm sorry, but I know nothing of what you're asking. A fairy bargain?" Mr. Erikson wrung his hands and shook his head, a tense expression on his face. "It sounds, well, forgive me, but you sound a little crazy. Is everything all right at home? I heard about your father. I'm very sorry for what happened to him." Pip stared at his music tutor, a wave of disappointment and dread rendering him temporarily mute. Mr. Erikson had been his last hope, his one final chance to unravel the magical contract and avoid Master Dobson's payment terms. And now he was hours away from being forced to leave his family and join the man in, what had he called it? The fair realm? For the rest of his days, if Master Dobson was to be believed. He rested his elbows on his knees and dropped his head into his hands, a sob threatening to choke him if he didn't let it out. What would he do now? Run? Fight? He had never been particularly adept at either. Perhaps if he pretended to join Master Dobson willingly, he could try to find a way out, a way to escape the bargain. He rubbed a hand over his face, grazing the stubble that had formed on his jaw and cheeks. It was hopeless, utterly hopeless. "Thank you, Mr. Erikson," Pip said, getting up to leave, despondency heavy upon his shoulders. "I'll bid you farewell and hope to see you again some day." Erikson's expression was conflicted as he showed Pip to the door. As he crossed the threshold, Pip turned and studied his tutor for a moment. "You truly don't know anything of Master Dobson and his magical contracts?" Erikson's hand tightened on the door handle, his knuckles turning bone white. and a muscle in his jaw leapt before his expression smoothed into a tight smile. "I'm afraid not. Best of luck, Master Reed." Pip sat at his parents' kitchen table that night, a glass of whiskey in his hand and one eye on the carriage clock his father had been given the previous year, on his 30th anniversary of working at the pit. He took a sip and swallowed it with a wince. He hadn't acquired a taste for alcohol yet, but he needed something to steady his nerves. The clock read 11:05. The spring equinox was less than an hour away. His time had almost run out. After his conversation with his tutor, Pip had begun to question whether he had, in fact, imagined the entire thing. The pressure of getting into the conservatory and being regarded as a great musician could well have gotten to him. Perhaps he had gone, as Mr. Erickson had said, a little crazy. "Philip?" Pip leapt out of his seat, spilling whiskey on the table. "Verity, what are you still doing up?" She pursed her lips and pulled out the chair opposite him. She wore a midnight blue nightgown and robe, her long, dark hair hanging over her shoulders in loose waves. His heart ached at the sight of her beauty. He did not deserve her. "Worrying about you. You haven't been yourself these past weeks. What's the matter, darling? Whatever it is, we'll face it together." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Is it your father? The household finances? Tell me." Pip sighed and swallowed the rest of his whiskey. Perhaps he should tell her. She might be able to convince him the entire scenario was nothing more than a figment of his imagination. Or maybe she knew something about fairies and their infernal bargains that could help him. As the clock ticked towards midnight and the spring equinox drew closer, he told Verity the entire sorry tale, from his failure to get into the conservatory on first try, to Master Dobson's caravan and the piece of paper he had signed, to the unsettling encounter in Vienna after he had asked her to marry him. Finally, he told her of Mr. Erickson's odd behavior when he'd confronted the man about his connection to Master Dobson. Pip hadn't failed to sense his tutor's nervous reaction to his questions. He felt sure his tutor knew more than he was letting on, but what could he do? The only thing left to do was wait and see if Master Dobson would appear and take what was rightfully his. Pip. Verity's eyes shone silver as he reached the end of the story. The clock read 1:15 midnight, and there hadn't been so much as a knock at the door. "Oh, Philip, why didn't you tell me all of this sooner?" "I'm sorry, my love. I understand if you wish to end our engagement and have nothing further to do with me." He dropped his head, but Verity gripped his chin gently and lifted his eyes to hers. "I meant what I said, Philip Reed. For better or worse. Now tell me what the library book said on the subject, and perhaps between us we can come up with a way out of this mess." Chapter 6. Pip jolted awake to the sound of floorboards creaking and rain pattering on the window panes. He had fallen asleep on the settee, Verity beside him, note papers scattered across the low coffee table where they had tried to think of a way out of Pip's deal. He sat bolt upright as his ears caught the sound of whispering voices. "Who's there?" 3 small men appeared from the shadows, as if they had taken corporeal form when called. He recognized Master Dobson, but the others were new to him, just as strange and grotesque as the market stall holder, short in stature with long limbs, large noses, and pointed ears. Their eyes glittered black in the early morning light, sending a shiver through Pip. He opened his mouth to... he wasn't sure what. Shout? Wake his family? "It would be better for all involved if you were to come quietly, Master Reed. Our magic can only do so much here. It would be an awful shame if we were forced to harm your loved ones." The man's casually threatening tone was enough to make Pip close his mouth. Despite hours of going over what Pip could remember of his initial encounter with Master Dobson, They had failed to come up with a single idea they believed could get Pip out of the bargain. He had no choice but to go along with these frightening creatures, and forcing his family to watch him be dragged away would do no good. With a hard swallow, Pip nodded and got to his feet. He moved slowly. His joints were stiff from sleeping in an upright position on the settee, and he wanted to spend just 1 minute more in the company of his beloved Verity before he said goodbye forever. He draped a blanket over her sleeping form and glanced at the papers on the table. "Can I leave a note?" Master Dobson's lips thinned, but he nodded. "Quickly." Pip scrawled a short note saying goodbye and apologizing for the mess he had gotten himself into, and for the black mark his disappearance would leave on her honor. He asked her to forgive him and thanked her for loving him. He signed the note, "Your Philip," and placed it in Verity's hand, careful not to wake her. "All right, I'm ready." Pip followed the creatures from the house, through the deserted streets of Heartwood, and up towards the pit where his father had worked. Something occurred to him at the sight of it. "Were you responsible for my father's accident? Was that your way of getting me to Heartwood, so that I'd be here when the time came for you to take me?" Master Dobson chuckled darkly and said without turning, "No, boy, that was simply a happy coincidence." Pip wasn't sure he believed it. They passed the pit, Pip's hair and clothes growing damp and heavy from the constant drizzle, and entered the vast forest that bordered Heartwood Village. The scent of wet leaves and living things hit Pip as they picked their way through the underbrush. It was almost as though he could smell the color green. Eventually, they reached a clearing where a pair of gnarled trees had grown twisted together, forming a natural arch. There was nothing especially remarkable about the spot, but Pip got the sense this was where they were heading. "Where are you taking me? What do you want? I don't know why you're doing this. I never meant for any of this." Dobson stopped and turned to face Pip, who stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by these odd creatures, and wishing he had tried harder to get away. "Would you go back and erase the bargain, if you could?" Dobson asked, one eyebrow raised. "Never taste success? Never meet your beautiful Verity? Would you stay in Heartwood and take care of your family and never play your music for audiences of thousands? Would you sacrifice everything you've had these past 3 years to avoid your fate?" Pip's breath caught in his throat. Would he? He tried to imagine living the life he'd always dreaded, instead of the miraculous, wondrous life he'd enjoyed since he signed Dobson's contract. Could he honestly say he would rather live that small, quiet, safe life and never know the magic of performing in Europe's most prestigious concert halls? Never fall for the most exquisite and talented girl he had ever met? Is that possible? He held his breath as Dobson's expression turned devilish. "No, I was merely curious. Now, come along, we haven't got all day. Through the portal, if you please." Pip's brows furrowed, but only for a moment, as the 2 other creatures each grabbed an arm and dragged him towards the archway between the trees. A peculiar sensation washed over Pip as they passed beneath the arch, and a second later he stood on lush green grass in another clearing altogether, where the sky was streaked with pink, gold, and orange as the sun rose on a mild, dry day, nothing like the wet, gloomy morning they had left behind in Heartwood. "Where are we?" "The Fair Realm, Master Reed. And as to your other questions, we are taking you to our home in the Gnome Kingdom. When you signed our bargain, you agreed to become the new Goblin King and join us in this realm forevermore. All we ask of you is to play your beloved piano for our enjoyment and remain with us until the day you die, or another Goblin King is chosen." Fair Realm, Gnome Kingdom, Goblin King? Pip's head swam and he staggered on his feet, but the 2 creatures, goblins, he now realized, still held his arms and kept him upright. He glanced at them and noticed that their features had become even more distorted and hideous. He questioned how he had ever believed them to be human. "You can't be serious." "Oh, but I am, Master Reed. I never joke about matters as serious as this." They walked on until they reached a place where the trees thinned and a small, grass-covered hillock rose out of the earth. There was a small wooden door into the mound, roughly the height of the goblins and far too small for Pip himself. Luckily, they didn't seem to be leading him towards the underground dwelling. He followed Master Dobson up a stone path that led to the top of the hillock, where a large courtyard spread before him, and at its center stood an elegantly carved piano. "If you please, Master Reed," Dobson gestured to the instrument, and Pip frowned. "You want me to play for you?" Dobson nodded and stepped forward to pull out the bench so Pip could take a seat. Sitting on the velvet-cushioned bench, Pip felt utterly bewildered. This was surreal. There was no sheet music, and the keys had been worn smooth by the fingers of his predecessors. He tried to imagine the musicians who had played this instrument before him, who they had been in their real lives, and how they had ended up in this place. Had they been tricked into fairy bargains like him? "What do you want me to play?" Dobson shrugged, affecting nonchalance, but his black eyes glimmered with mischief. "Whatever comes to your mind. Your favorite piece, anything you want. Just play." Pip pressed down on the F key, held it and let the note fade away, listening to the way it sounded as it died. Next, he played a quick scale, testing the instrument's consistency. Satisfied, he pushed his glasses up his nose with his forefinger and lay his hands upon the keys. With a deep breath in and out, he began to play a simple Chopin piece, one he had always enjoyed and found to be a good measure of any new instrument. As he played, Dobson and his lackeys began to dance. It was somewhat incongruous after the threatening way they had brought him here. He hadn't expected to have to perform straight away, but at least they seemed to be enjoying the music. While they were distracted, he might have a chance of finding a way to escape. More of the creatures appeared, climbing the path to the courtyard, males, females, and children filling the space and joining the others in their dance. By the time the piece was finished, there were dozens of goblins surrounding the piano and dancing, their long limbs flailing, large feet tapping. As the final note rang out, Pip launched into another piece, this one by Schubert, except Pip hadn't meant to keep playing. He hadn't even consciously chosen the piece. He tried to stop playing and found that he couldn't. His fingers kept moving across the keyboard, his foot working the pedal, and the goblins kept dancing. What was going on here? Had Dobson enchanted the instrument so that Pip would be unable to stop playing until Dobson decided it was time? The Schubert piece ended, and Pip's fingers played Beethoven, then Bach, then Chopin again, followed by Mozart. Pip's fingers were beginning to ache, and the panic that had risen up in his chest was beginning to consume him. Would Dobson ever let him stop playing, or would he die on this very bench, starved and sleep-deprived? Hours had gone by. Pip still played the piano, and the goblins still danced, apparently unfatigued. Tears ran down Pip's cheeks in a constant stream. He understood now that he wouldn't be able to stop until the curse that had been placed on him came to an end. His mind ran over and over everything that had happened, searching for the smallest hint or clue that could get him out of this nightmare. Dobson had said he was obliged to remain here and entertain the goblins until he died. Or another goblin king was chosen. That was it. But how would he find another goblin king to take his place? And how could he, in good conscience, condemn another person to the very same fate he was trying to escape? A shout went up, and some of the goblins scattered as a figure appeared in the courtyard. 2 figures, Pip thought, though his vision was obscured by his tears. "Philip!" Verity rushed towards him and took his face in her hands. She was a sight for sore eyes. Her cheeks flushed and her hair wild. Her breath came in short pants, like she'd been running full pelt. He wanted to kiss her, but he couldn't stop playing. "Philip?" She looked from his tear-stained face to his dancing fingers, and realization dawned on her face. She tried to stop his hands from moving, but it was no use. The magic seemed to prevent any interference. She gave up and put her hands on his shoulders. "It's going to be all right, darling. I've brought Mr. Erikson with me. He's going to make everything right. I promise you'll be home safe soon." Mr. Erikson was here? Pip looked to where the goblins were still dancing, albeit hesitantly now, the wild abandon they'd previously shown displaced by this unexpected interruption. Mr. Erikson was noticeable by his height, the goblins barely reaching his chest, and by his stillness. He was speaking with Master Dobson, who had also paused his dancing. Erikson's palms were spread as though he were pleading with Dobson. Begging for Pip's release? He hoped upon hope that's what the exchange was about. Finally, Dobson nodded, a resigned look on his twisted features. Erikson closed his eyes for a moment, a shuddering sigh racking his body. Then he looked up and locked eyes with Pip. An unspoken understanding passed between them. The music tutor crossed to the piano and took a seat beside Pip on the bench. "I'm sorry for everything. This was my curse, not yours. I was afraid before, but I'm ready now. I'm ready to accept my fate." Pip didn't understand what his music tutor was telling him. The bargain had been meant for him? Erikson joined in with the Bach piece Pip was playing, and after a moment, Pip felt something intangible rush through him, like a shiver, a pressure lifting somehow, and his fingers stopped playing. He slumped, exhausted, and Verity caught him. She was much stronger than she appeared. Years of practicing the violin for hours had given her a physical fortitude he'd never recognized before. Erikson looked to Pip, fingers moving expertly across the keys, his expression grim. "Go now, quickly, and forget this place. Forget me, Philip. You never needed the magic. You were always talented. You were my best student. Please forgive me." When Pip only stared at his tutor, frozen in fear and confusion, Erikson raised his voice. "Go! Before it's too late, and don't come back." With Verity's help, Pip got to his feet and stumbled across the courtyard, weaving through the horde of reveling goblins. None looked his way, absorbed in the beautiful music coming from the piano and the silver-haired man now sitting in Pip's place. Before they descended the hillock and lost sight of the gathering of goblins, Pip looked back one last time to see his music tutor playing the piano with his eyes closed, a calm expression on his handsome, aging face. He looked serene, at peace. They hurried through the forest, searching for the archway that had allowed them to step through into this realm, Pip clinging to Verity's arm as he stumbled along. He had so many questions. He scarcely knew which to ask first. "How did you find me?" "There was knocking at the door, and when I opened my eyes, you were gone. Your tutor came looking for you. He was devastated when he saw he'd arrived too late. He was babbling about a curse, and I realized he knew who had taken you. He told me he'd been a foolish, arrogant young man, and had sought out the goblins, looking for a way to guarantee his success. They had promised him talent and fortune, the likes of which he couldn't imagine, for 3 years, and in return he would be compelled to join them in the fair realm forevermore. But he negotiated with the goblins. He offered to send them talented young musicians in his stead, and they agreed." Pip stared at Verity, wide-eyed. He'd been handed to the goblins as payment for Erikson's own bargain? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The man who had taught him the piano, his greatest passion and the thing that brought him the most joy since he had been 8 years old, had given him up to a fate worse than death in exchange for his own freedom? And yet Mr. Erikson had come to take his place and let Pip go in the end. What courage it must have taken to knowingly resign himself to the fate that he had sent many young musicians before him. Pip found that he couldn't hate his tutor for what he had done. Hadn't Pip wanted the exact same things? Fame, fortune, to be the world's most brilliant piano player no matter what. In the end, greed and arrogance had been the downfall of them both. Now, thanks to Mr. Erickson, Pip had a chance to make amends for his past selfishness. He only hoped he would be worthy of his tutor's sacrifice. Pip and Verity staggered into the clearing where the trees entwined, forming the arched doorway, and without a glance behind them, stepped through. Epilogue. Victor's fingers were numb from hours of playing, but he knew he had done the right thing this time. Pip hadn't been the first young musician he had condemned to this fate. There had been others before him. Victor had moved on each time a student had disappeared. It helped that the youngsters had become erratic and nonsensical in the days and weeks running up to their disappearances, babbling about fairy creatures and magical contracts. Nobody suspected Victor of any wrongdoing, and he was able to set up a new practice in the next town with no dark cloud hanging over his name. But this time had been different. Philip Reed was unlike the grasping young people he'd sent to Master Dobson in the past. His ambition was not born from a selfish place. He had only wanted to escape the desolate future that lay before him in Hartwood, and to provide for his family by making a living doing what he loved. Victor had respected his students' admirable intentions. Unfortunately, Victor had become desperate. It had been years since he had sent a student to Master Dobson. He'd needed a sacrificial lamb, and Philip, with his rejection letter and broken spirit, had been too perfect. But after years of sending young musicians to a fate worse than death, he had begun to feel something. Shame? Regret? Or perhaps all the years of moving around, running from his fate, had finally caught up with him. Whatever it was, he could no longer live with his decision. As he played, the goblins began to fall asleep one by one, collapsing from exhaustion, until the entire courtyard was filled with their snoring, unconscious figures. The spell was temporarily broken, and Victor stretched his fingers, arching his back and rolling his neck. He stood up and pushed the bench under the piano, then found a shady, peaceful spot on the grassy hillock to lay down. He needed some rest. As soon as the goblins awoke, he would be compelled to play for them until they slept once more, and every day until he could play no more. The time had come to accept his fate.
I hope you enjoyed listening to One Fair Eve by Lyndsey Hall, narrated by Paeter Frandsen of Christian Geek Central. If you want to read more by Lyndsey, go to lyndseyhallwrites.com to find more of her books. I will have a link in the show notes that takes you directly to where you can snag her free book, A Fair Deception. If you enjoyed listening to Paeter narrate the story, you might also enjoy listening to his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. If you have a story you want featured on the podcast, be sure to check out my contact page where you can apply. Or if you want to nominate a story you've read, please do so. I'll always be looking for more. If you need links for any of the sites I've mentioned, be sure to check out the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.